The rain hammered against the window pane as Emily Carter sat motionless at the kitchen table, her fingers curled tightly around a crumpled hospital bill. The pale light of dawn tried to break through the storm clouds outside, but inside, the darkness felt heavier. She stared at the numbers on the page, numbers that might as well have been carved into stone, numbers that meant life or death for her son. Noah's fragile smile from a photograph on the fridge met her tear-filled gaze, a reminder of the boy who, at just 8 years old, had shown more bravery than Emily thought possible. Her heart ached as she remembered the doctor's voice the night before, soft, but firm, and laced with sorrow. "We can't wait any longer, Miss Carter. If you don't secure the funds by tomorrow morning, the donor will be assigned to another child. I'm so sorry." She had tried everything. She had sold her car. She had sold the last gift from her late husband, the silver locket he gave her on their wedding day. She had begged, pleaded, and applied for every loan she could find. She had even swallowed her pride and stood in line at a charity office, only to be turned away when the funds ran out. And now, time was running out for Noah. Emily's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, hesitating over the name glowing on the screen. Grant Whitaker, the CEO she had hoped never to need. On a personal level, brilliant, ruthless, the kind of man who could buy and sell entire city blocks with a signature. She worked for him, or at least, for one of his companies. And though he barely noticed her among the sea of employees, she knew one thing: he had the power to save Noah with a single decision. What would it cost? The thought made her stomach twist. She knew his reputation, a man who didn't give anything for free. But what choice did she have left? If dignity was the price, she would pay it. If her pride had to be shattered, so be it. For Noah, she would walk through fire. Her thumb hovered, then pressed call. The phone rang once, twice. Then his voice, smooth as steel and just as cold. "Grant Whitaker." Her voice cracked as she spoke. "Mr. Whitaker, I need to see you. It's urgent." There was a pause on the other end. She imagined him leaning back in his chair, assessing her, calculating what this was about. "My office, 8 sharp." The line went dead. Emily exhaled, the weight of what she was about to do settling on her shoulders like lead. She stood, wiped her tears, and went to check on Noah. The sight of him sleeping, pale and small beneath the blankets, gave her the strength she needed. The next morning, she stood outside his office, heart pounding, dressed in the only formal outfit she owned. When she entered, Grant didn't even look up at first. The room smelled of leather and power. When he finally met her gaze, his expression was unreadable. She told herself to speak, but her voice failed her. He watched in silence as she tried to find the words. Finally, she managed, "I need an advance. A large one." His brow arched, his fingers steepled together. "How much?" 200,000. His eyes gleamed with something sharp, curiosity, maybe, or something colder. "And what do I get in return?" She swallowed hard, wishing the floor would open beneath her. But for Noah, she would not back down. One night she whispered, "That's what you want, isn't it?" One night, the silence that followed was deafening. The storm outside paled compared to the storm in her heart. Grant studied her, his expression softening for the briefest second, so brief she might have imagined it. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I didn't think you had it in you, Miss Carter. I admire that." And so the choice was made. A choice she never imagined she'd face. A choice that would haunt her forever, or maybe, somehow, save them both. What neither of them knew was that this night, this deal struck in desperation would be only the beginning. The clock on the wall ticked louder, as if counting, down to the moment that would change everything. And as Emily stepped out into the rain again, she no longer felt its coldness. She felt only the weight of a mother's love and the price she was about to pay. The hotel lobby was quiet, but Emily's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she crossed the marble floor. Each step felt heavier than the last. She barely noticed the grand chandelier above her or the polished brass elevator doors reflecting her strained face. All she could think about was Noah, lying pale in a hospital bed, waiting for a miracle. She was about to buy with the last piece of herself she had left, when the elevator doors slid open at the penthouse floor. Emily hesitated. For just a moment, she considered turning back, running into the night, finding some other way. But the image of Noah's frail hands clutching hers gave her the courage to press on. She raised her chin, straightened her shoulders, and knocked on the heavy door. Grant opened it himself. Gone was the suit and tie of the office. He stood in dark slacks and a simple shirt, sleeves rolled up, as if this were just another business deal. His eyes held no triumph, no smugness, only something unreadable that unsettled her even more. They stood in silence. Two souls at the edge of a line neither ever thought they'd cross. Emily stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her, shutting out the world she once knew. Hours passed slowly. The night unfolded with few words spoken. There was no cruelty in Grant's manner, no arrogance, just a strange quiet, as if he too felt the weight of what they had agreed upon. Emily waited for herself to break apart, to shatter into pieces she couldn't put back together. But she didn't, because in the end, her mind was with her son. Every second, every breath, was for him. When dawn light touched the edges of the city skyline, Emily gathered her things. Grant handed her a black bag. No words, no conditions, no gloating. She took it with trembling hands, her heart aching with what she had given away. But there was no time for regret. She left without looking back, stepping into the chilled morning air. The world felt different now, heavier somehow, but filled with a single, burning hope. She would get to the hospital, she would pay for the surgery, and maybe, just maybe, this sacrifice would save Noah's life. What Emily didn't see was Grant standing at the window, watching her disappear into the waking city. For reasons he couldn't understand, he felt hollow. He had expected to feel powerful, victorious. Instead, all he felt was the sting of shame and something that felt dangerously close to sorrow. Neither of them knew that this night's bargain was only the first ripple in a tide that would change both their lives forever. The hospital corridor seemed endless as Emily hurried down its pale, sterile stretch, the black bag clutched so tightly in her hands that her knuckles turned white. Every beep of a machine, every murmur of a nurse's voice reminded her that time was slipping away. When she reached the billing office, the receptionist looked up, startled by Emily's breathless urgency. Without a word, Emily placed the bag on the counter and unzipped it just enough to show what was inside. "I have the money, please. Tell the surgical team. He can have the transplant." Her voice cracked under the weight of exhaustion and desperation. The woman behind the desk blinked in shock, then quickly picked up the phone. Within minutes, the hospital moved into action. Emily stood by the window, watching the snow flurry outside, unaware of the tears streaming down her face. She had done it. Noah had a chance bought with the only thing she had left to give. In the operating room, Noah lay still, his small chest rising and falling in slow rhythm under the hum of machines. Emily wasn't allowed inside, but in her mind, she was right there beside him, holding his hand, whispering promises of better days. The hours crawled. Every time a doctor passed, her heart leaped into her throat. When at last the surgeon approached, mask lowered, eyes soft, Emily froze. "It went well," he said gently. "The graft took. Now we wait. But you gave him the chance he needed." Emily nearly collapsed, relief hitting her harder than she could bear. She whispered a thank you, though she wasn't sure to whom: the doctor, the universe, or the memory of her late husband, whose photo she'd turned away the night before. But while Noah slept, recovering from the battle his body had just begun to fight, Emily knew she couldn't rest. She had to face the consequences of what she'd done. The next morning, she walked into the office, hair still damp from the hospital sink, eyes ringed with exhaustion. She tried to slip in, unnoticed, but Grant was waiting. His gaze found her immediately as she entered the building, and this time there was no coldness, no smirk, there was only silence. Later, she found an envelope on her desk. Inside was a note, in his sharp, precise handwriting: "Your son's life is worth more than one night. I hope someday you'll understand." And below that, the check she had expected to cover what was left of the hospital bills untouched. Emily stared at the paper, her hands trembling, a mix of anger, confusion, and something she couldn't name swelling in her chest. She didn't want his pity. She didn't want anything more from him. All she wanted was to be left alone to rebuild what she had lost. But life, she was learning, had a way of unraveling even the best laid plans. And neither Emily nor Grant could see that the night they thought was the end of their story was, in truth, only the beginning. Emily thought the hardest part was over. She had paid the price, secured the surgery, and now all that remained was to stay by Noah's side and pray for his recovery. But life wasn't done testing her. In the days that followed, she found herself fighting a different kind of battle, one she hadn't expected, one that came not from sickness or poverty, but from whispered judgments and piercing stares. Word had spread. She didn't know how or who, but it had. At first it was just the glances, coworkers who avoided her gaze, neighbors who no longer smiled at her in the hallway. Then came the whispers, the quiet conversations that stopped when she entered a room. The charity she had once served soup with at the shelter suddenly had no volunteer shifts for her. The bank where she'd pleaded for a loan sent cold, impersonal letters about her outstanding debts. But Emily's focus stayed on Noah. His cheeks had a little more color now. His eyes opened more often, and when they did, he tried to smile at her through the pain. That was all that mattered. Grant watched this unfold from afar. He noticed how Emily, once confident in her quiet way, now kept her head down. He saw the weight she carried not only as a mother, but now as a woman judged for choices no one had the right to question, and it did something to him. One evening, as snow began to fall again, Grant's car waited outside the hospital. Emily stepped out, into the cold air, pulling her thin coat tighter around her. She froze when she saw him, unsure whether to approach or turn back inside. He opened the door, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Let me give you a ride." Every instinct told her to refuse. But the exhaustion, the bitter wind, and the simple longing to not feel so alone made her nod. The ride was quiet at first. The city lights flickered past, casting fleeting shadows on their faces. Grant finally spoke, his words careful. "I never meant for any of this to happen. You should hate me, but instead, you're standing taller than anyone I know." Emily stared out the window, her voice barely a whisper. "Hate you? I don't have time for hate. I only have time for my son." Something in her honesty shook him more than anger ever could have. And in that moment, Grant realized he couldn't just stand by anymore. The next day, Emily arrived at work to find everything different. The rumors stopped. The stares disappeared. A memo had gone out from the top. Any employee found spreading gossip or harassing another staff member would be terminated. No exceptions. And that was only the start. Behind the scenes, Grant began using his power not to control, but to protect. He reached out to specialists, quietly covered bills, still unpaid, and made sure Noah had access to treatments few could afford. But he didn't do it to win Emily's gratitude. He didn't do it to ease his guilt. He did it because somewhere in the middle of this storm, he had begun to see her, really see her. A woman of strength, a mother who had given everything, and the thought of her standing alone against the world no longer sat right with him. Emily didn't know what to make of the changes. She didn't want charity. But when she saw the new light in Noah's eyes, the tiny improvements in his health, she knew she couldn't push it all away. Sometimes, help came from where you least expected. And sometimes, hearts began to change when no one was looking. The night air was still as she stood by Noah's window, watching the snow blanket the city below. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, it could be something brighter. What neither of them realized was that fate wasn't done with them yet, and the next chapter of their lives would demand more courage, forgiveness, and faith than they had ever known. The winter sun filtered weakly through the hospital blinds. As Emily awoke in the chair beside Noah's bed, her body stiffed from another sleepless night. But that morning, something was different. Noah's small hand rested in hers with a warmth she hadn't felt in weeks, and his breathing was easier, calmer. When his eyelids fluttered open and his tired eyes met hers, Emily felt the kind of joy that words could never capture. "Mommy." His voice was thin, but it was his voice, steady, hopeful. "I'm here, baby. I'm always here." Outside that quiet moment, though, the world was changing in ways Emily hadn't foreseen. Grant Whitaker's name began appearing in places she never imagined. The hospital's foundation announced a major donation in honor of children fighting cancer, a new wing state-of-the-art, funded anonymously, but she knew. She knew because she had seen the shift in his eyes, the way his guarded walls had started to crumble the night he drove her home in the snow. But Emily's pride warred with her gratitude. She didn't want to be someone's charity case. She didn't want Grant or anyone to think she'd made that choice in the hotel for anything other than her son's life. And so, when the hospital administrator mentioned the donation over coffee one morning, Emily forced a smile, but kept silent about what she suspected. Meanwhile, whispers about her and Grant resurfaced, but this time, they were different. People spoke of kindness, of strength, of a boss who protected rather than judged, and yet, Emily remained cautious. She had lived through too much heartache to trust so easily. Then came the evening that changed everything again. Emily returned to Noah's room after filling out more paperwork and found Grant sitting quietly by the boy's bedside. It was the first time he had seen Noah up close, the first time the reality of the child's struggle hit him full force. Noah, always polite despite his weariness, offered a small smile. "Are you Mommy's friend?" Noah asked softly. Grant swallowed hard. No deal, no business plan, no contract had ever made him feel so small, so humbled. "I'd like to be," he answered honestly. From that night on, Grant's visits became more frequent. At first, Emily bristled at his presence, afraid of what people might think, afraid of what she might feel. But as days turned into weeks, she saw the man behind the fortune, a man who was just as lost, just as broken in some places as she was. Together, they watched over Noah. Together, they found quiet moments where words weren't needed. And slowly, something fragile and unexpected began to grow between them, something neither of them had dared to hope for. But just as Emily started to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could have a future beyond hospital walls, and whispered pasts, a storm she hadn't seen coming threatened to undo it all. A letter arrived, a summons that would force her to relive the night she tried so hard to forget. Someone had found out. Someone who wanted to use her secret to destroy not only her, but the man, who had begun to mean more to her than she ever thought possible. The question now wasn't just about survival. It was about whether Emily and Grant could face the truth of that night, stand together, and prove that even the most painful beginnings can lead to something beautiful. The real test of strength, of forgiveness, and of love was only just beginning. The envelope lay on the small kitchen table, its contents heavy with unspoken threats. Emily stared at it, the words of the letter seared into her mind. The anonymous sender had written with chilling precision, detailing that night at the hotel, hinting at exposure, at scandal, at tearing apart the fragile new hope she and Noah had begun to find. But more than her own ruin, what haunted her was the promise of dragging Grant's name through the mud, turning his generosity into fodder for tabloids, making Noah a target for cruelty. Outside, snow fell gently, but inside Emily's heart raged a storm. She thought she had endured the worst: Noah's illness, the impossible choice, the lonely nights. But this was a different kind of test, one that threatened to shatter the peace they had fought so hard to build. She didn't wait. Clutching the letter, she made her way to Grant's office, every step fueled by a mix of fear and determination. The receptionist tried to stop her, but one glance at Emily's face silenced any protest. When she entered his office, Grant looked up from his desk, surprise flickering in his eyes at the urgency in her expression. Without a word, she handed him the letter. He read it once, then again, his jaw tightening, his fingers gripping the page. When he looked up, his eyes weren't filled with anger or shame. They were filled with something far fiercer. Resolve. They think this will break us, he said quietly. They don't know us at all. Emily felt tears threaten, but she refused to let them fall. I won't let Noah be hurt. I won't let this ruin what he's fought through, what we've all fought through. Grant rose, coming around the desk, his presence steadying her in a way she hadn't expected. Emily, you've carried this alone long enough. Let me carry it with you now. Together, they formed a plan not to hide, not to cower, but to face the storm head-on. Grant called in his legal team, but not to silence or threaten. He chose transparency, determined to tell the truth before anyone else could twist it. And so, a statement was released. A story told not in shame, but encouraged, the story of a mother's sacrifice, a child's fight, and a man's awakening. The media, expecting scandal, instead found a tale that moved hearts. Public opinion shifted, not against them, but in support of them. Messages of empathy and admiration poured in. The blackmailer, whoever they were, vanished into silence, their weapons stripped of power. But more than the world's reaction, what mattered was what grew quietly between Emily and Grant. In the aftermath, trust, respect, a bond born not of that desperate night, but of everything they'd endured since. Months later, as spring melted the last of the snow, Noah ran across a park field, his laughter echoing in the air, his hair catching the sunlight. Emily watched him, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Grant stood beside her, not as a savior or a shadow of the past, but as a partner. What began as an act of despair had become a story of strength, redemption, and second chances. And as the world moved on, Emily knew that some choices, no matter how painful, could lead to the most unexpected and beautiful beginnings. Because sometimes, the hardest storms give way to the brightest skies.